This video has been uploaded much later than planned. I've had a complete nightmare, to be honest, with my hard drive, which is sort of stuffed full of videos, and have been on the phone to Apple for hours over the last couple of days. It's all sorted now. I've put it onto an external hard drive. I've overcome the internet problems. I'm now back in London, where I've discovered that my home broadband has to be the worst compared to any third world countries I've visited in Asia. So for all my moaning about the internet in those countries, I don't know if I'm going to get sued if anyone watches this in the future if I say the name of this horrific company that I've been with, but I've now changed internet providers, and so I can now upload regularly. I'm going to upload every Friday. Sometimes I'll manage to get another one up, and when I do, I'll upload that on a Monday. I haven't shared my own personal experiences with narcissists so far, and it hadn't really occurred to me to talk about this until I mentioned it in the comments section to someone, and we ended up having a conversation about it in the comment section, and it occurred to me that actually I probably should talk about this. It's something that I've only told a couple of people about because nothing happened to me. I was fine. He tried to make me one of his victims, and I'm going to talk about how he did that and how I responded each time, and also about how I felt, because I think it could be really useful to talk about this in terms of our intuition and when we listen to it and what might get in the way of listening to it. John Worboys is known as the black cab rapist. He would drive a black taxi around London, usually central London, and then he would pick up his victims. They'd get into his taxi, and he would tell them a story about winning money on the lottery or in casinos, and he would sometimes he'd even carry a plastic bag around with his with lots of money in it. I think there was over £3,000 in it when the police found it. So just to try to prove his point that he'd won all this money. And he would invite the women to have a drink with him to celebrate, and then but he would put sedatives into their drink. When the sedatives had taken effect, he would rape or sexually assault them. This person is in prison now. He was put away for assaulting 12 women. The police think that there may have been over 100 women who were assaulted by him, but the problem was they couldn't get enough evidence together. So, he only went into prison for those 12 offences. In 2018, in January, he was nearly let loose. The parole board said that he was now, he was going to just be released into the public, and there was this huge outcry in London, and the person who had been responsible for the decision has now resigned from the parole board, and John Worboys is still in prison now. In the back of his car they found a rape kit, as they called it, which was mini bottles of champagne, crushed up pills that he was putting into the champagne, condoms, and various sexual paraphernalia. So in his garage at home, they found all of these notes that were written to remind him of what to say to the police if he was caught by them, because they were already onto him at this point. Apparently, he had been married for 8 years and he had sexually assaulted his stepdaughter, and so that marriage ended. This was 12 years ago, and yet I remember it in so much detail. And I think that says something about our intuition and how when something feels really wrong, it really stays in our minds. Because obviously I didn't know anything about what he'd done at that time. I didn't know anything until I saw his face in a newspaper a while later. 12 years ago, I I saw things differently. You know, I reacted to that situation differently from how I would now. And I'm going to talk, while I explain what happened, I'm also going to talk about how I would view that situation now compared to before. So what happened was, I think it was spring, and I had a little rabbit called Jasmine. I actually had two rabbits. One of them was called Jack and one of them was called Jasmine, because I'm quite a fan of J names, because the rabbit I had before that was called Jessica. So Jasmine was a dwarf. She was a mini lop, and they are renowned for having problems with their teeth. So I was taking her to the vet, and you know, in her carrier. And this vet are very strict. If you're late, they don't see you. You're allowed 5 minutes. If you're beyond 5 minutes late, they don't see you. And the mini cab that I was going to get hadn't turned up. I was feeling really stressed because, you know, I didn't want to be over 5 minutes late. I called the vet and told them I was going to be late, but even if you call them, they don't wait for longer than 5 minutes. So I'd ended up jumping into a black taxi, and it was John Worboys' taxi. And so, you know, we were sitting there in a traffic jam. I remember the lights were red, but even when they changed, we probably weren't going to be able to get through them because there were so many cars ahead of us. I was just feeling really stressed. I had the beginning of a migraine, so I could feel this pain behind one of my eyes. So we were sitting in this traffic, and that was when he told me he had won the lottery. And he said that, you know, it was something like 200 grand that he'd won. So it wasn't utterly unbelievable. It wasn't like millions. And he said that this was the last day of his job, that he had to do this run because he'd promised someone. I can't really remember the details, but it seemed believable because it wasn't like he'd won $1 million, you know, and he seemed really happy. And he said that was it. He was going to quit his job after that day. And while we were waiting in this traffic jam, he asked me if I wanted some champagne to celebrate with him. So this was the first time something felt really strange because I had believed the story about him winning the lottery. Now, would I have believed it? I think I probably would have, because he did a really good job. He seemed really convincing. So anyway, so there I was, you know, and he just offered me champagne. The way he offered it to me was to say that lots of people had been drinking champagne with him all day. And you know, his different customers had been sort of cheersing him with a little bit of champagne, and he asked if I wanted some. I felt really surprised because it's so it just seemed so bizarre. You know, that was my immediate reaction before I really had any time to think, was just surprise and confusion. The way he asked was really casual, and I think that threw me more because you know, there was that sort of there was that strange difference between the way he was saying it as if it was normal and the surprise of hearing it. This was the first time he'd intruded on my boundaries because it wasn't a professional way to behave. You know, you don't normally treat a customer like that, do you? Give them champagne. I thanked him and I said, and I explained that, you know, I didn't like the idea of sharing a cup. I'm a bit funny about sharing cups with people. Now that's true, I am. You know, if I don't know someone, I don't really like the idea of drinking out of their cup. But also, regardless, my feeling was just no. I just didn't want to have champagne, you know, with him. There was something too weird about it. So at that point, I felt like it had been an offer, and I was free to say no. So I you know, that was okay for me. That was quite comfortable. But then the way he reacted to that was to say, oh, I have all of these cups, you can have your own cup. You know, he had all these plastic cups in the front of his taxi. And at first I thought he was joking, because that seemed so weird to me. And I said, I laughed, you know, and then he said, no, seriously. And I said, I don't believe you. And then he showed me all of these plastic cups he had. And so at this point I felt a feeling of being intruded on, and I felt uncomfortable. It was just a really strange situation. And he continued to try to persuade me. He said a few things in a very casual way, as if the decision had already been made and I was going to have some of his champagne. And at that point, I felt a feeling of absolute repulsion. And I also felt a bit trapped. And, you know, I didn't know why. I didn't consciously know why. I didn't think, you know, is he going to spike my drink? What does he want? So I think that feeling came from my intuition. There was something unconscious happening. He must have been giving off something that I was picking up on that didn't feel right, beyond the fact that he was doing something strange and offering me this champagne. I think the reason I felt trapped was because he was talking about it as if it was going to happen, you know, as if he was convinced it was going to happen, which is quite, you know, it's quite a common sales tactic, isn't it? When you do this, this is going to happen, it's going to be amazing, rather than if you do this. So it was kind of a similar thing that he was doing to me. I knew that I really didn't want to do this. I had a feeling of feeling cornered, and like, this person had a forceful character. And I think from the moment I got into the taxi, I probably gave off a vibe to him of being, well, I was young and very friendly and warm. So I think he thought that I might make a good target, because I might be one of those people who wants to be polite and will sort of put being polite in front of feeling uncomfortable, you know. If this happened to me now, I might well have still had that feeling of repulsion, you know. That was what my intuition was telling me, that something wasn't right. But I don't think I would have felt pushed into a corner now. I would have been much more comfortable with just saying no, thanks, and not been particularly bothered about how he reacted to that. So at this point, he had walked over my boundaries really twice, because now here he was again encouraging me to drink this champagne after I'd already said no and given an excuse. So now I gave him another reason why I couldn't have the champagne, which was that I had this migraine coming on, which was true. I knew that if I smelt white wine or champagne, it would set me off. And so I knew that I wasn't going to accept the champagne. If I hadn't had that migraine, I still wouldn't have wanted to have any of the champagne. Not because I consciously thought that he was trying to harm me in any way. I just, it was also the middle of the day, you know. I guessed it was probably some kind of not very nice Prosecco or something. And those feelings I'd had of repulsion were enough to convince me I definitely didn't want any of his champagne. So at this point, he then said to me, oh, just have a sip. You only need to have a sip just to cheers me. So what he was doing there was he'd already created a sort of story in terms of these different false facts, you know, obviously not really facts. And now he was creating a story about himself as this person who wanted something from me. He wanted some kind of support from me. And so in that sense, he was going to be the victim. if I said no. And he'd already told me that all these other people had had champagne with him. So I was faced with feeling like a sort of a rude and uncaring person a bit. I mean, that is how I felt. I felt bad to say no again. So I ended up, I already had this strange feeling about these plastic cups that he had and that he was having champagne with all these people. There was something about it, I think because his general mood, it didn't seem that he was elated. And so there was some feeling of sadness I had about this guy who, had just won the lottery and was celebrating with random strangers and asking them and needing something from them, needing this support from them. And, that made me feel sad and a bit sad for him, but there was something about him that made me feel not so much sorry for him, but more repulsed by him. When I said no again, I said no, honestly, even smelling it, I'm just going to feel it's going to really make my headache worse, which is true. And his response was to say nothing. And I could feel that he was really annoyed. He was in a huff, really. And if that happened now I know quite a lot more than I knew then. I didn't know what a narcissist was, for example, back then. Now, if that happened, I would feel like, okay, this is his problem, and it's weird that he asked me. I'd feel much more in my rights to just say no thanks, and I don't think that I would have had a lot of feeling about it. But at that time, I felt really uncomfortable that he was now in a bad mood with me, and I doubted myself. I questioned myself, and I thought, all these other people that have got into his taxi, they've had a sip of champagne with him. Am I being a bit mean? In my mind, this guy had just won the lottery, so you'd think that I'd be feeling like, wow, he must be having the best day ever, and if I had any feeling, maybe I'd feel some envy or something. But actually, I didn't feel. I just had this feeling of sadness. So maybe unconsciously, that this was because the way he came across didn't match this situation he was describing. He was consistently distant from when I first got in the taxi. So even when he was telling me about how he'd won the lottery, he was actually being distant. And when he was offering me the champagne, he was doing it in a sort of playing hard to get kind of way. So he wasn't in my face persuasive. He was more cold, really, and distant. That's my cat Caspi on the scratching post. So I'm telling you that because that's something to look out for, the distant sort of vibe you get about someone. Sometimes a narcissist can seem friendly, so you can't, you're not always going to see the distant vibe as obviously, but it's more an intuitive thing. If you can, even if they're acting in a friendly way, if you can feel there's something distant about them, you're probably picking up on something. I ended up saying to him, so what are you going to do with the money? Trying to sort of cheer him up. And looking back, I think that's quite interesting because he'd walked over my boundaries a few times now by offering me, by not accepting the first time I said no, by trying to encourage me a few more times, trying to persuade me, by then trying to make me feel bad about it a couple of times, and now by being in a mood. So that's quite a few times now that he has overstepped my boundaries and not respected them. And yet I was the one that felt like I needed to do something for him. I owed him something. He told me that he and his wife were going to buy a house. They were going to move out of London. But he never seemed really that happy anymore. You know, when I'd initially got in the taxi and he told me he'd won the lottery, he had seemed happy, and how he behaved seemed to fit with his story. So I had this sense really right until I got out of the taxi that somehow, you know, that this guy was really annoyed with me and that he thought I was a really unfriendly person. And I got out of the taxi, I went to pay him. He had a kind of charisma about him. And he wasn't, in some way, you know, in a kind of way, he wasn't really using it. He was being grumpy and cold. And when I looked at him after I got out of the taxi, his eyes looked cold. He looked familiar for some reason. You know, I could see the side of his face from where I was in the taxi. And I said to him that he looked familiar. I don't know why, but somehow I seemed to recognise you. You know, maybe I'd got into his taxi in the past. Maybe that was why. And he told me that he had been a stripper, and he was in his early 50s at the time, and he wasn't in great shape at all. You know, so again, I thought this was a joke, and it turns out that it wasn't. You know, he said, no, I was, and he, you know, kept repeating it, and I got the feeling when he was telling me that he thought this was going to impress me. But at the same time, he didn't behave in a slimy way. Anyway, I got out of the taxi, paid him, and I just remember just having this feeling, a cold feeling from him that left me feeling uncomfortable. Many of his victims were picked up at night, so they may well have been, you know, have had something to drink, and then I think you're less likely to listen to your intuition in that situation. And I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he'd picked me up at night. If I didn't have a migraine, I wasn't in a rush, I wasn't stressed, I'd had a nice night with friends in a bar, I'd had a couple of drinks, would I have considered cheersing someone, you know, with a bit of champagne for winning the lottery? I don't know. I don't know how strong that intuition still would have been. You know, but I do know that if you've had something to drink, you're likely to listen to it less. And, you know, that's why I thought this is a good thing to talk about. I think if you're going to go out, it's a good idea to bear in mind that you're going to be less likely to listen to your intuition. If this had happened now, when he offered me the champagne, alarm bells would have rung. It wouldn't just be surprising, it would put into question for me his whole story about winning the lottery. You know, I think I would think, is that story true, or was it, is this a way to get me to drink his champagne? Has he put something in there? You know, I'm now quite suspicious of drinks from strangers. I've had my drink spiked in the past, you know. So now I would have had a different reaction to it, and I would have turned him down without feeling bad about it. If I was in the same situation now and he had ignored me and seemed to be in a huff after I'd turned him down, I would know that was his problem. And even if I believed that he'd won the lottery and he hadn't meant me any harm, or, you know, and that lots of other people had had champagne with him, I'd still know that it was absolutely my right to say no, and that if he had a problem with that, that was his problem. I was too confused to step back and question why he was so keen for me to have a drink of champagne with him. You know, why he put it to me so many times. I think I felt too uncomfortable to really question that. Again, I think now it would just annoy me if he asked definitely more than twice. You know, I wouldn't see it as that he had a need to have other people celebrate with him, and if he did, I think I'd just see that as that's his problem, really. But at the time, those uncomfortable feelings, I felt guilt about them, when in reality, all of those feelings were a result of him walking over my boundaries. And I think that's what a lot of people do, especially women, and it's, that's changed for me with age, but, and that's the same with a lot of people, that this changes with age. But the reason why is because, as you get older, you obviously have more experiences, but people who have always experienced relationships with narcissistic people right from childhood, it doesn't really matter how old they are, they might continue to doubt their own right to have boundaries. And I think it's really important, if you feel uncomfortable with somebody, if they're pushing your boundaries, they don't have to be aggressive or rude to push your boundaries. If you feel this uncomfortable feeling of pressure, I think it's really important to ask yourself why, just to wait for a moment. There's no rush to give someone a response, and just to ask yourself, what is this feeling about? Is somebody intruding on me and on my boundaries? The worst thing that can happen is you can offend someone, but that's not going to kill them. He had somehow orchestrated this situation so that I was feeling guilty and like I owed him something, because I hadn't taken the drug he was planning to use to rape me. And, obviously I didn't know that was his plan, but he did. He knew that. And he was quite prepared to try to make me feel guilty for not accepting this drug so that he could rape me. And so, those are the people who you might be up against. If you're listening to your guilt, feeling like you need to be polite, just be aware that there are people who really will take advantage of that you would be their perfect target, because they're looking to turn those feelings against you and to use them to manipulate you. When we hear about a woman being sexually assaulted or raped or murdered in the newspaper, I think very often we have this assumption that she couldn't control the situation that was that existed just before this happened, as if that she was probably walking down a dark alley and someone jumped out from behind the bushes. I think this is a fear that women have, that I think they probably should have, to make sure that they're safe, walking home at night and so on. But in most cases, when women are raped or murdered, it's by somebody they know or are at least acquainted with. And there would have been red flags, I would say, I don't know if, I would wonder really if in every situation there would have been red flags, but certainly in most of them, there would have been opportunities for them to trust these, their intuition, and notice these red flags and protect themselves. And so many of us ignore our intuition. And I think there's a reason for that. I think it's partly because intuition, it creates often a feeling in our bodies, and we're used to ignoring discomfort in our bodies, especially if you have a sort of fast-paced life, if you live in a busy place, a city. I think we're used to not always being able to eat when we want to, waking up earlier than we want to, working later than we want to, and feeling tired. In London, we're used to being stuffed on a tube on the underground like a sardine, so not having the personal space we want to have. So I think because we're so used to having to ignore this discomfort in our bodies, we can ignore the uncomfortable feelings that come from our intuition. And I think also there can be something in us that stops us from taking these feelings seriously. Feelings of guilt, for example, can get in the way of us trusting a feeling of discomfort we have. It can be confusing because if you feel guilty about something, your sense is that you are somehow abusing someone, even if it wasn't intentional. So when an abusive person puts you in the position of being the abuser, when they turn the tables like that, that's a way that they can trap you. You get trapped by your own feelings of guilt. Luckily, that didn't affect my decision. I didn't have any change of heart. There was no part of me that was about to take him up on his offer. I could live with feeling that guilt. I think there are some people who can't, and who will put the other person before their own needs. And that's also something really important to watch out for. You can't give somebody else that responsibility. Nobody else can help you to gauge whether you're being rude or whether you're being polite, whether you should feel how you do or not. You just can't trust another person's reaction. Imagine if I'd really trusted, I already trusted his reaction. I already felt bad, like I must have been rude. And yet he knew that he was planning to make me one of his victims, and that all I'd done was luckily escape that situation. But of course he had no qualms about suggesting to me that I was in the wrong for doing that. So you just can't trust a stranger with letting you know if you're being rude or not rude. You have to be prepared to offend people, because boundaries are meaningless if they only exist as long as everyone's happy with you. You have to be able to enforce them. He had pleaded not guilty on all counts. He'd said that he talked to women because he wanted attention, because he hadn't had enough cuddles when he was growing up. And so again, he was painting himself as the victim. He was saying that all the sex had been consensual as well. And, so that's quite interesting in when I think about what I picked up on, the way that he had painted himself as a victim to me by being so offended when I had said no to the champagne. He's not the kind of person that would have grabbed someone and pulled them down an alleyway. He's somebody who would pretend that he is a nice person and that he wants something from you, that if you're nice enough, you'll give it to him. And that's just having a drink with him in his taxi, to celebrate something with him. When it comes to situations with people who interact with us first and who have a mask of being a nice person and manipulate us in order to abuse us, in that kind of situation, I can choose that I'm going to have control. And the way to do that is to make sure that I have boundaries and that I listen to those boundaries no matter what the situation. A really good way to protect yourself from people who are dangerous, who can cause harm to you, is to watch your boundaries and watch those feelings. If you have a feeling of discomfort, if you feel guilty, ask yourself, have I definitely done something that that is sort of regrettable and impolite, or is somebody creating a story where I'm somehow the abuser when really I know that I'm not? Am I having a knee-jerk reaction of guilt, or is this something that I've had a moment to think through? And I think it's good to just be aware of when are you likely to maybe not listen to your intuition. As I said before, when you've been drinking, you might be sort of less likely to listen to it as much as you might otherwise. And what about if the person's really attractive? In future videos, I'm going to talk about Ted Bundy. He was a really attractive guy. He came across as really helpful, helping women to carry their books and so on. So what if you met someone who was really attractive, but something they did made you feel a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit pressurized? Would you let that go? Or would you listen to that? Would you be prepared for them to lose interest in order to assert those boundaries. Because trusting these feelings can save your life. It's that important. I'm going to be talking about my experiences with narcissistic people in future videos, and I'm also going to be talking about your experiences, because people have emailed me, telling me about their experiences and asking if I might want to make a video about them. So, and I think that they could be quite interesting. I always think it's good to have examples, and I'll carry on talking about famous narcissists that we've heard of, but I think both are probably going to be quite useful, because we're less likely to meet a murderer, aren't we, than a sort of, as I call them, garden variety narcissist. So if you do want to email me about your experience with a narcissist that might be good for a video, you can email me at contact@liveabusefree.com. So I hope that was helpful. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.